All right. Hello, O&A. It's the mid-afternoon. Y'all had your lunch. You're getting kind of lethargic. We're about to talk about the future. You're kind of settling in for some inspiration. But before we begin, I would like to ask you all to do me a favor. Just rise from your seats, take a second, and just stretch it out, stretch it out. Introduce yourselves to the people that you don't know on your right and on your left. Just say hello. Sharing some space.
It's good so we don't forget who we are either.
Right, just in case that moment comes.
All right, don't get carried away now. Don't get carried away now, people. Come on, we got a panel to hold. We got a panel to hold. I know you like each other. I know you like each other, but you know, come on, settle it down now. Settle it down. Let's start. Goodness. All right, so we are here. This session, whose future is this? We're here to spend an hour telling some stories about the future in the dark.
Lighting.
We actually have no slides, so we're just going to be talking. We're just going to be telling stories for an hour. I have with me a distinguished panel. I myself am Matt Thompson. I'm the deputy editor of theatlantic.com. Hello. To my left is Teresa Giacino. Teresa Giacino is an associate editor at the Mary Sue. For more on Teresa, you can see teresagiacino.com. Right next to Teresa is Yatasha Womack, an author of Afrofuturism and the novel Rayla 2212, for which she is working on the sequel, and a director of the Bar Star City film. You can see more on her at Yatasha Womack on Twitter, YTASHAWOMACK, in case you can't read her card. Cheryl Vint is a professor of science fiction and media studies at UC Riverside, where she oversees the Alternative Futurism's research project at Sawyer.ucr.edu. The hashtag for our session is ONA Future, and you know, we will have a classic panel Q&A time, but also, I want to encourage all of you to use our hashtag ONA15Future, ONA15Future, to tweet out any interesting questions that come up to you over the course of the conversation. Don't feel like you need to wait for the Q&A to pose an interesting question over Twitter. My man Greg Lynch, who put together this session, is going to be scanning that Twitter stream just to see what stuff you all are asking and may interrupt at any time to shout out a question for our crew. So, a little definition of terms before we begin the session in earnest. It is going to get really complicated really quickly to talk about a future, to distinguish between futures that come from minority cultural traditions in the U.S. and futures that come from white guys in the U.S. So we're gonna use a little definition of terms for the moment. We're gonna talk in terms of two futures. So there's one future, or one set of futures, I should say, that I think, you know, because there are so many blockbuster movies that come out of tradition, we are all broadly familiar with. This is like Blade Runner, The Matrix, Minority Report, Ex Machina, Snowpiercer, and I love me some Ex Machina. I mean, I love fine Oscar Isaac. But we're going to call these familiar futures. We are also going to be, but for the duration of this session, we're going to be telling stories about the future that come from communities that by definition are not the majority communities. They're not communities, they're perspectives that by definition, most of us do not have access to. They are from our cultural edges, from the edges of all of us. And so we are going to call these edge futures. The futures that we're talking about this afternoon. Why are we interested in edge futures? Why do we want to tell these stories? I mean, one, because it's important to have a multiplicity of futures as we consider the world that we are making, that we want to make, that we fear making. But also because it's interesting. When you dive into, if you wanted to get a sense in the 18th century of what a binary language across a distance would look like before the invention of the telegraph, you would go to where the Kele drum language was used to communicate between cities at a distance. before that tradition died out in the mid-20th century. If you wanted to find a place in the mid 2000s where a mobile payment system was already spread throughout society and mainstreamed, you wouldn't probably go to Silicon Valley. Venmo hadn't yet come about. You would probably go to Mombasa or Kenya, where the M-Pesa payment system had already spread throughout the culture. There are visions of the future that come from all over the place. And so we wanted to spend an hour just talking about some stories about the future that come from some interesting edges. So once again, hashtag is ONA15Future. Please don't hesitate to tweet out your questions. I'm going to start it all off with a broad question to all of you, starting with you, Teresa. I just want to hear, tell us a story about the future that you find particularly interesting and compelling.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for having me here.
Of course.
Something that I know I talked about, I don't know if any of you have read this particular novel, a novel by Maria Doria Russell called The Sparrow. Can I just see a show of hands if anybody's read The Sparrow? Okay, cool, awesome. The Sparrow, I thought, is one of the most interesting science fiction books I've ever read because a majority of it, when it's not taking place in space, takes place in Puerto Rico, and I'm Puerto Rican, so this means a lot to me. But it also comes at science fiction from the point of view of Jesuit priests. So in this book, this Puerto Rican Jesuit priest becomes a part of a space mission, basically to bring the word of the Lord to aliens. But so the Jesuits are kind of funding space travel. And they come up with the money first, and they put together this, they have a team of scientists working with them. There's a biologist, and they have all their science bases covered. But the point of the trip, in addition to making history, is also to spread the spirituality, this religion that is important to them. And the main character is of color, and so I thought it was an interesting cross-section of, bridging science and spirituality together and showing how they can kind of coexist in a space with people of color kind of leading the way. And it's written by a woman, so that's nice too.
It's interesting when you talk about, some of the familiar futures that we know from the blockbuster movies. Faith does not it does not serve as a focus of The Matrix or Minority Report or what have you. But in fact, when you look at the history of media, both distant and recent, faith and faith works are in a really important way as we think about media, a really important way that media has been translated and made. Looking at just translations of the Bible throughout history will tell you a lot about how language spread and how media was used to communicate. So that's a really interesting vision. Yeah. Yatasha, tell us an interesting story about the future.
Well, I found a short film called Pumzi by Waniri Kahua to be really fascinating. She's an East African director, and the film was compelling because it looks at what would be post-apocalyptic Africa, but it was highly technological. And the main character was a woman. And I think for some people, just that image alone was not consistent with images that they associated with Africa, of course. But in it, there's this quest, and she winds up wanting to really connect with nature. And to me, it was a really intriguing film because it highlighted the value of nature and how important it is. And I think in our excitement about technology, sometimes we forget about the beauty of nature, and nature becomes almost this enemy of sorts, where we have to create these technologies to protect ourselves, which we understand that. But to think about water, say, being incredibly rare, which in some cases we're starting to see inklings of that being a larger conversation. Or if you think about just, the sight of a tree. We take that for granted. We see trees all the time, but if there's a point where, it's this rare experience, I just think that for me, it really brought home the beauty of nature, but looking at nature as an expression of science in a way that's, of course, more organic, and looking at technology as an attempt to duplicate what nature creates, obviously, naturally. Oh, the film's called Pumzi. That's P-U-M as in Mary, Z-I. And it's a short film.
Just as a really quick follow-up, I'm curious, did you see Fury Road? Did you see Mad Max Fury Road?
No.
Okay, because this is another, I'm curious, for those of you who watch Pumzi afterwards, go watch Pumzi, and I want to hear how the depiction of water and water scarcity and droughts in that film compares to Mad Max Fury Road, which is another interesting sort of depiction of the future. I'm curious what juxtapositions you see in those works. Cheryl.
So thank you for having me here.
Thank you for coming.
There's so many different and exciting features other than the ones we're used to seeing in mainstream Hollywood. So I had a lot of trouble figuring out which one to open with. But the one I decided to talk about is another short film. This one's called The Cave, and it's by a First Nations filmmaker named Helen Haig Brown. And there's a lot of things I find really interesting about this film. And part of what is exciting to me about it is its style is such that a lot of people wouldn't recognize it as science fiction at first glance, I think, but it's very clearly science fiction if you know the field. So it's in the Cherokee language, and the audio track is actually someone from the Cherokee Nation, an elder, a voice recording that was made of him telling a real story that comes out of their spiritual tradition. And Helen Haig Brown got permission to use it in the film. And then what the story shows is it shows in the 1960s an indigenous hunter going out to hunt bear. And he goes out and hunts like with a rifle and with sort of modern to that contemporary period equipment. So it's already kind of playing with our notions of First Nations people as kind of trapped in time and not technological and only living a 19th century kind of lifestyle. And he pursues the bear through this cave that seems to be a portal to another dimension, to another time, certainly to some place where time works differently. And what he finds there, at first glance, appears to be, it seems he's gone into the past. He finds people that are practicing subsistence agriculture. They're doing a lot of things by hand in agriculture rather than with machines. And they're living in a very lush environment. The color of the film is really saturated, so everything almost glows. It's such a beautiful space that he finds. And at first it seems that he's gone into the past. But then when these people see him, they tell him, no, this is not for you, you're not ready. And they're able to compel him away using like force field kind of technology. So they obviously have a very highly advanced technological society, but the visual way in which it appears in the film is minimized, and it doesn't sort of overtake nature as we see in many of our familiar futures. And so he's told he's not spiritually or intellectually, the film leaves it ambiguous, but he's not ready in any case to be with these people who are simultaneously of the far future and have this very utopian society, but who are also embracing traditions of more sustainable agriculture, which come out of indigenous science. And so it's sort of also pressing us to think differently about the kinds of images we're willing to call science fiction.
One of the things that's interesting about futurism to me is as often, so some of you know that 10 years ago I made a short futurist film with my friend Robin Sloan called Epic 2015. It was a vision of the media past set 10 years in the future. And one of the things that Robin and I sort of learned in reflecting on the process of creating that story was that we were telling stories as much about our present as we were telling stories about the future. And you read that in a lot of futurism, a lot of futurist fiction. George Orwell, in writing 1984, is writing about the world that he sees around him in 1948. But one of the themes that came up in our conversation was about the way that the works that you all have encountered play with time itself. Investigations, not just of going forward, but going past. And I'm sort of curious, just as a broad open question for the room, what you have found in a work about the future, what interesting excavation of the past you've encountered, or that has struck you, that you would want to bring out for us.
Oh, well, I can say,
No, please.
Well, I can say in my work, Rayla 2212, I wanted to create a character who was not limited by our definition of what a woman could do or what a person of color could do. I didn't want her to have any kind of social constrictions. So placing the character in the future on another planet enabled me to create a world where she didn't have to deal with some things you might assume someone may have to deal with today. And in doing so, I wanted to also have this character who's on another planet. Her name's Rayla Ilmatic, and she's a time traveler, and I made her a time traveler specifically to help orient the character and things that are happening today, but also to keep her boundless so that she's not limited to my concepts of today, but she can travel to the past, Earth's past. And in so doing, it becomes really an act of recovery on two ends. You know, on the one hand, you're claiming that people of African descent did exist in the past and made contributions, but then you're also stating that, you know, people of African descent are also in the future. And my character in that sense is very boundless. And for me, that was freeing as a creator. But, you know, it is sort of a theme that you do see surfacing in a lot of works, this whole concept of timelessness.
There's this interesting, you know, at the Atlantic right now, we have this project going on the American Dream. It kicked off with a survey this summer where we surveyed in partnership with the Aspen Institute, thousands of people about the American Dream, their conception of it, how likely they felt to live it, what it meant to them, and what have you. And one of the themes that surfaced in it was about optimism and pessimism. The interesting note in this is, by and large, the people of color that were surveyed felt that the American dream was not dying. It had, in fact, not yet been born, that the American dream was ahead of the country. Because, I mean, it makes sense, sort of, if you think about where both immigrants, people of color, like coming to this country, how they relate to that theme and idea. While, by and large, the white Americans that we surveyed felt that the American dream was, in fact, dying as a majority population. But it's interesting to sort of locate that sense of sort of optimism, both in where you think about what is optimistic, and whether you're moving towards a dystopia, which is also a characteristic of much of our fiction, futurist fiction, or whether you're moving towards something that may be better than where you came from.
And I think sometimes culturally, when people like talking about communities of color, or, and I'll speak about Black cultures in the United States, it's kind of situated in a dystopianism. And so there's kind of this bridge that you're connecting of times and places where you're not locked by that statement of existence.
Yeah. Something I was, in relation to your question about, you know, examining the past in the future, related to the press. Because there's so many stories from Babylon 5 to Battlestar Galactica where, you know, the press is kind of seen as this demon that needs to be slain. Or it's like this problem that needs to be eradicated. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that they kind of show the press as this, like, basically as a parasite. Like, the press is just there when disaster happens to, like, get their, you know, viewerships up, and then they leave. Like, they're covering the war or whatever's happening in the future. They're covering whatever, but they're not really doing anything to help, and they're not really doing anything to make anything better. But then I know we were talking about, I don't know if there are any Trekkies in the house. Deep Space Nine, what? Jake Sisko on Deep Space Nine, who is the son of the commander of the space station, becomes a reporter. He ends up, over the course of the show, wanting to be a journalist. And he kind of uses his abilities in that area to kind of expose corruption during the Dominion War, and kind of like he's using press for good, I think, the way that a lot of journalists kind of see themselves, you know, and they, you know, so it's an example of journalism in the future that, you know, is doing the right thing and actually like making changes happen. But yeah, it's interesting that a lot of future views don't look too kindly on people in the press, which is really sad.
A lot of present views don't look too kindly on people in the press if you look at those Pew studies. I want to talk about frame flipping moments for a second. I had this moment. I read Yatasha's lovely book, Rayla 2212, and there's this phrase that I loved that just planted in the middle of the book. So the lead character of the book, the protagonist, her name is Rayla Ilmatic. And the reference, the last name's never explained through the book, but there's one moment where they're sort of conjecturing on why this character, why she was named, where the name Ilmatic came from. And someone says, well, you know, someone along the line in her family lineage must have been a fan of ancient rap music. Ancient rap music is one of those phrases, you encounter it and you think about it, and it sort of instantly sort of sets apart this vision of the future from others that you may have encountered previously. We think about hip-hop rap music as being something that is fresh and contemporary, despite its, you know, now being pretty middle-aged. But it is a current music. When you see ancient music referred to in futurist text, often you're hearing about Bach and Beethoven and Mozart. But it is a reminder that, in fact, yes, one day Nas will be an ancient artist, so ancient that his name even escapes mention, and that the things that we take for granted as fresh today, as fresh and contemporary today, will one day be ancient. Historians will excavate those aspects of our culture to try to get a sense of what we're like today. I'm curious about those frame-flipping moments as you encountered them in the futures that you've read. Has there been another moment, Cheryl, as you've been investigating futures from all over the place? What moments have flipped your frame?
I think one of the really interesting things that some texts could do, and I can think of 2 or 3 texts that do this in different ways, so I won't summarize them all at length because I'd rather mention all of them so that you guys can read these great books. So one of the conversations that happens in science fiction is about a sort of lack of diversity in the characters and what it would mean to sort of transform the field to be more diverse. But the books that I think are more exciting in the sense that they flip the frame in this way you're suggesting is they don't just sort of take your usual science fiction story and then add character of color and then, you know, stir and then you have a more diverse future. But they posit different histories leading up to either our present or a slightly into the future from us. And so one example I can think of is a book called Alchemists of Kush by Minister Faust, which has 2 storylines. One is set like 7,000 years ago and one is set contemporary to the novel's publication. But in the relationship it posits between these 2 worlds, 7,000 years ago being when human civilization was really centered elsewhere and centered in regions of the world populated by people of color, that an entirely different worldview emerges from that and shapes how we think about everything and makes us realize exactly how much ways of imagining the future that we think maybe are neutral and don't really have anything to do with questions of social justice are really deeply embedded in histories of things like colonialism, for example. Another great example is an African novelist named Abdurrahim Waberi. He has a book called In the United States of Africa, and it's largely a satire. It's very much in a Jonathan Swift kind of mode, but it imagines that the center of civilization never left Africa, and Africa colonized the rest of the world. And it's a world that in many ways is not that different than the world we live in. There's still problems with capitalism. There's still problems with economic inequality. There's still problems with immigration and migration. There's still global warming. But every single thing that's framed is framed through African history, African names, African language. So again, it makes a totally transformed world, even if the details of the sort of jobs people have aren't necessarily all that different. It makes us really just think about all that world differently. And the final one I'll mention is by a Los Angeles novelist, actually a Latino Los Angeles novelist named Seshu Foster, who has a book called Atomic Aztecs. And it flips between 2 possible futures. His character seems to bounce back and forth between the world, which is basically the mundane world we live in, where his protagonist is sort of economically struggling and he's working in an East LA slaughterhouse. And then sometimes he flips into this other future where the Aztec Empire never fell, Spanish colonists never came, and all of North America is part of this huge, really contemporary, really modern, really technological Aztec Empire, but again, everything filtered through South American cultural forms.
Greg, are there folks tweeting questions to the ONA 15 future?
We have
Shane, can we turn on the floating mic? Thank you so much.
Okay, we have one that's just a question. Oh, is it on?
Not yet.
Is it on?
You think so? All right, well, you can.
There we go.
There we go.
There.
Okay,
Nice.
we have one from Patrick Dell who asks if anyone's read Ancillary Justice, an Ancillary Sword by Anne Leckie, where gender is pushed to the background and characters are all she.
Yeah.
I have.
Yeah. Has anyone read Ancillary Justice? Yep.
She has.
Awesome.
Yeah. Any reflections from that work that you would draw?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting series. I think Ancillary Justice was more interesting than Ancillary Sword.
Yeah.
But yeah, that the main character is a part of the ship's AI embodied in physical form, actually, and so she doesn't understand gender. And what's more, she moves among different alien cultures who have different concepts of gender. So we have sort of some places where what we think of as natural or normal gender applies, but other places where different rules apply. So it does that thing that I think science fiction does best, which is making strange what otherwise seems familiar and making us realize how strange some things we take for granted are. Because as this character tries to figure out like what the proper pronoun is and doesn't understand why people get so upset when you use the wrong pronoun, and it really makes us think about how these divisions and labels are constructed and embedded in power relations.
There was a great, I want to say GQ or Esquire story several years back, maybe a decade ago, positing that Michael Jackson was actually the vision of the future person, the self-designed, self-constructed, fully engineered sort of, where your sense both of body, of gender, of shape, of everything could be made or changed. Ancillary
interesting.
Justice very much reminded me of that story going back to artists. But that theme about, I mean, what you said, Cheryl, about the way that great science fiction, these moments when you encounter them, they tell us something interesting about today, or they shift, they make us strange to ourselves. They shift the present in a way that feels familiar. I'm curious, going back to this question of works and worlds that you've encountered, what would you, tell me about a work that has told you something interesting about the world that we live in now, in the media or technology landscape that we exist in today?
It's funny, I always think about, I'm a huge Joss Whedon fan, and even though a lot of Joss Whedon stuff does have a lot of problems, and as I have been writing more about issues like this, I see the problems even more, and I'm like, oh no, don't destroy what I love. But I'm thinking about the show Firefly. I don't know if anybody has watched that. Yeah, Firefly. And what's always interesting to me about that and what that says about where we are is that, here Joss Whedon's positing this world in the future where everybody speaks Chinese because, there are more Chinese people on the planet than anybody else, and it would make sense if in the future, all of a sudden we're speaking Chinese. Like they've collected on all their debt, they're they're running everything. And so everybody speaks Chinese, but there aren't actual Asians on the show. So everybody's speaking Chinese, and the Chinese apparently run everything, but you don't actually see a Chinese person. So that's very telling about where we are currently in that, here's this great idea of the future. We need to include China. And then they left out China, and they left out Chinese people and their viewpoint on things. So it's just a lot of white people speaking Chinese, which is weird. But yeah, it's thinking about something like being inclusive in fiction kind of, I think, applies to media and journalism because, what is, reporting a story? It's a story. Like you're telling a story. It's all storytelling. And the same way that one would expect maybe a TV writer or a novelist to populate their fiction with different viewpoints, with, characters of all different races, genders, etc. we should maybe think about approaching the stories we tell in the media and in the news the same way. You know, it's like you can't write about an event and leave certain people out. You can't like write about, you know, a national story without leaving out most of the nation. So maybe, I mean, if it helps to think about writing your news stories the way you'd write a screenplay. If you want to like improve representation in Hollywood, it's like do the same thing for real life, you know? So I think the two are very connected.
Yatasha, as a novelist, when you think about world building and constructing, I mean, what are some of the things that you look to, both in works that you've encountered, but also as you construct worlds and characters? What are some of the things that you look to for inspiration in society?
Well, it's always interesting for me to see what's preserved and what's not. So when you look at the idea of the character Rayla Elmatic, you know, where obviously, you know, someone was a Nas fan, but for that to continue to be relevant, you know, several centuries later on another planet means that there were a group of people who went above and beyond to ensure that that was known. You know, was there a war of sorts to make sure that that was known? Was there destruction to make sure no one knew that anything else outside of rap music existed? You know, I mean, that's not part of the story, but it kind of points to, you know, if you look at the names of our streets, the names of our cities, the way things are created, it makes us think about what's preserved, what's not, and why, and who's dedicated to ensuring that either these sets of values or these names continue to exist, and what was maybe stomped out, and what stories aren't told as a result. So that's kind of what I look for. And I guess as a journalist, you're always looking for the untold story, right? That's what gives you the edge to be able to get works out. And so for me, as a creator, I look for those untold moments that have really shaped culture and think about how these things are preserved.
So I'm going to ask you the same question, Cheryl, about what scholarship in your scholarship, what you've come across that tells you something interesting about our world today. But then I am going to do an open call for questions for folks. So if you want to step up, we've got a mic up here, and please do not hesitate to step up and ask your questions. But Cheryl.
Yeah, I think I agree with Yatasha that what's most interesting is the untold stories. So stories that emerge from different cultural traditions, and then just different things become normalized. They become the name of spaceships, or they become the way you practice agriculture, or they become the way that you do or don't have spirituality as part of your vision. And preparing for this panel, because one of the things you asked us to think about was how the media is portrayed in the future, and I was actually kind of surprised to discover that I had a hard time thinking of examples where media are that central to the future. The one I could think of is Paolo Bacigalupi's The Water Knife, where his main character is a journalist. And it has to do with the fact that in this region and other parts of the Southwest, we are running out of water and we can't really sustain the populations we have. And so it's this sort of water wars future, kind of like Mad Max, but not quite so much makeup yet. And his journalist character is really, she struggles a lot with her own personal risk, and then the question of like how much difference reporting on this can make. So I thought that was interesting, that really, I think, addresses a contemporary sense of, that the media can have this interventionist role, not simply a kind of neutral reporting role.
Yeah, the media shows up in sort of interesting ways in some of these futures. I believe in Poomsy, in the film that Yatasha mentioned, I believe that the main character is a museum curator.
She is.
Yeah. Right.
Interestingly enough, I mean, media construed broadly, not just journalists, but also folks who curate exhibits for museums and what have you. In Station 11, by Emily St. John Mandel, wonderful post-apocalyptic, very cheerful post-apocalyptic novel.
Yes.
what persists as sort of surprising in her world? The fact that the main characters, the protagonists, end up in a traveling caravan and symphony, telling stories about Shakespeare, performing Shakespeare plays for audiences from town to town.
Oh no, I was gonna say actually, in the book realm, it just popped into my head, but a really interesting and positive view of the press. There's an author, Mira Grant, who that's her pen name, Shannon Maguire.
Shannon Maguire.
She wrote the Newsfeed trilogy.
Zombie trilogies are my personal weakness, I've just got to say.
It's kind of amazing. It's an amazing trilogy, and basically the first book is called Feed, and it's set in a world after the zombie apocalypse, where infrastructure is completely ruined, and the only journalists left are bloggers. And so they upkeep the network, and they become like the superstars of journalism, and because they're the only ones left. And so but it becomes a dangerous line of work too, because they're covering stories in a world of zombies. So it becomes like a military job. Like you have to have medical tests, you have to be carrying armor and weapons and all this stuff. Like you kind of become like.
There are 3 types of journalists she mentioned?
Yes. There's like the newsies who are just into the story. Then there are the ones who actually like beat up the zombies. There's like her brother.
Who was the guy who tragically died? He was an adventuring, pioneering journalist in an accident in Australia. He was bitten by a crocodile. It was like Steve Arms?
Oh, Steve Irwin.
Steve
The
Irwin.
Irwins. Yes, they're called the Irwins, and they're named after Steve Irwin, because they're the ones that are actually basically going out and poking zombies with sticks. And so, they bring their cameras out, they're poking zombies, seeing what happens. So they're the Irwins. And then there's a third group.
It's like the gossip bloggers, basically.
Yeah. Oh, the romance fiction. It's romance fiction. So those are the 3 types of bloggers that are left in the world. There's the newsies, the Irwins, and the romance novelists, because you need your fanfic no matter where you are.
Future of journalism, ladies.
Future of journalism. It's pretty impressive, but it goes to show like that long-standing like need for the truth to be told, the story to be told. So read Feed by Mira Grant. It's awesome.
It's funny, actually, that journalists don't show up more in apocalyptic fiction, given that information is a need in moments of apocalyptic
You
crisis.
need to know stuff in the future too. Like,
Questions from the crowd? Please stand. And Greg, if you would, thank you very much. Say your name and affiliation. And
Oh, okay. Hey, I'm Justina. I'm a UNC junior majoring in business journalism. I wondered, so you were mentioning the TV show, I think, about how all society is speaking Chinese, but there are no Chinese
Yeah.
around.
Firefly.
Firefly, yeah.
Okay, and so, we're in America, and there's a growing minority here. So, like, growing minority means less white people, like, in the whole scheme of things.
Right.
And we're all speaking English. So what does that mean whenever if we realize that our scientific fantasies and scenarios and predictions actually become reality, and what are the next steps after that?
Interesting.
So is the question like what?
English, I think, is a part of the question, right? Like we are now positing. I mean, even Firefly posits a future in which the majority
Do not speak English.
Yeah.
Or speak English and something else.
Yeah, in a combination. But our futures, language and our ability to communicate when we think about the direction that the population is going, I think, is how do we imagine communicating with one another in the future?
I mean,
no, go ahead.
I was gonna say it's interesting because I think. Right now, either we've gotten there already or we've come close. In California, it's a majority Latino at this point. And
Texas, too, I believe, has just gone over the threshold.
yeah, and
Or maybe
it's,
Texas went first and then California? I don't know.
probably. It's, but it's interesting to think, like, it would be interesting to see a, future America story where, it's in Spanish. But also it's because it's kind of a difficult thing. I mean, on TV and film, it's a little easier because you can do subtitles. But you also do have to remember the audience that you're writing for now. So it's like if you're thinking of a story in the future, like you are also thinking about the people who are reading it. And if I wanted to write a novel in Spanish, like a sci-fi novel in Spanish, only people who speak Spanish can read that. And it's like, but the people who speak Spanish already know, like, they might already share my vision of the future. You know what I mean? Like, so it's it's an interesting balancing act.
And there is the device. There are sort of dueling theories in some ways, I think, about race and the role, race and culture and language and the roles that they will play in all of our futures. We are mostly broadly all familiar with the phrase postracial, one of the one of the ideas that
That fake thing.
Postracial has been so side-eyed at this point that we are in a post-racial world. But one of the ways that we had of thinking about post-racialism is that actually it seems more when you look both at American history and at where we seem to be heading, that we have a more enhanced and more an exacerbated understanding of our cultural backgrounds, that we are actually super racial to the point where, you know, my German American boyfriend, who just used to think of himself as white, now thinks of himself as German American with a little bit of Polish and an Indonesian princess in there in a few generations back. But we have this sort of more fine-grained understanding of our racial edges and lineages that we are, even if we grew up in America, but our ancestors came from other places, we have a more fine-grained understanding of what that means and where those distinct strands come from. I'm curious about that, as in the futures that you all have encountered. How do we think about race, culture, language? How do those manifest in characters' identities?
Well, one of the things I had to do with the Rayla 2212 novel was to recognize that while I wanted to do a project about a woman of African descent and place her on another planet, I had to realize if it's 200 years into the future on another planet, you know, race as we understand it may not necessarily exist. You know, I can't even, and I had to accept that, you know, looking at her in the context of being American would not necessarily exist. You know, which then points to just the creation of race in general, which is something that Afrofuturism explores in terms of viewing race as a technology, you know, a system of categorization that was very much created. You know, and this is outside of, you know, just culture, but just the idea of race, you know, and how we identify that. So we live in such a racialized world, and one thing I like about Afrofuturism is that it highlights that this is a created system, which for some of us now, you know, I'm sure some people are thinking, huh, how, what? But, you know, 500 years ago, the idea of being a white person or a black person just simply didn't exist. Not to mention all the other cultures that emerged out of that. So I think that when we were talking earlier about kind of flipping the script, that's a good perspective to look at things from. There was an artist, a musical artist, Sun Ra, who's referenced frequently in the context of Afrofuturism, and he used to say, don't you know it's the end of the world? You know, the end of the world already happened. And when you look at things from that context, you know, what was the apocalypse? You know, was it the transatlantic slave trade? Was it the, you know, beginning of the colonization of North and South America? You know, I mean, you can pick all kinds of points. But if you look at, from a storytelling standpoint, if you look at that as a backdrop, then that just gives you a different lens for telling stories. And one quick note, I just wanted to say that a lot of what we call familiar futurism or familiar sci-fi is really a reflection of colonialism. And this whole idea of the alien and who's the alien. So when the young lady was asking the question earlier around stories in the future, I think we have to deconstruct this nature of what we're calling alien and looking at where that concept or that fear came from. So some of, you know, society's fears around populations taking over, et cetera, were very much codified in what was more or less traditional science fiction.
Yeah, and I think that science fiction as a kind of print discourse anyways, as it developed, because film and television have distinct histories that they don't always speak to one another. But science fiction kind of started out almost in this sort of post-racial vision that science fiction communities and writers imagine themselves generally as liberal, generally as progressive, and there weren't really lots of people of color in the futures they depicted, but it was sort of like, oh, because race doesn't matter, so it's fine, we're beyond racism
So everyone
in
looks
the future.
the same. Of course they do. 'Cause
Yeah.
nobody sees color.
And so, like, the conversation right now is really about how important it is to acknowledge specificity and realize that we can talk about difference without it becoming a hierarchy, and to really create kind of diverse and inclusive futures instead of say like, oh, that we're beyond racism because we don't actually have different races anymore or different cultural traditions anymore.
I will note there's one big cultural divide that manifests in Yatasha's book between folks on the planet that Earthlings settle, Planet Hope,
Right.
and Earth itself, which is also this is a theme in a lot of science fiction that if we start settling other planets, that cultural divide becomes important. Okay, we have a question over here in the back.
Hi. I'm Laurie Penny. I'm a journalist and I write science fiction among other things. And my question to the whole panel is about, I guess maybe you guys can explain more of the context of this, but in the sci-fi community as well as in the media, over the past couple of years in particular, there's been a huge backlash against diverse writing and diverse storytelling, and we saw that this year with the Hugo Awards, among other things. And I was wondering if the panel could speak about what this says about the power of diverse narratives and the political power of storytelling, that there is this fear.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Lori. Gamergate is descending on us as we speak right now. I'm seeing it happen.
I'm holding them back. I'm holding
Thanks
them
for
back.
that, Lori. Thanks. All right, let's talk about the Hugos for a second.
Oh my God.
Well, what I would say is that, yes, there is a vocal and outraged contingent of what seems to be mostly straight white men who feel their work is not getting the recognition it deserves, and that the reason is because of political correctness or other much more aggressive ways they have describing that, and that the community as a whole shut them down. All the nominations, they managed to game the system and get their selectees nominated on the Hugo ballot. People voted no award in that category so as not to reinforce this kind of behavior. Some of the authors who aren't people of color that were nominated by this process but who didn't want to be associated with that kind of ideology withdrew their names from nominations. So, I mean, I think there is a contingent of people who are outraged we're having this conversation, but that they're not, they're outraged because they're no longer able to control the conversation as they once did.
It just struck me that several folks in the room might not be familiar with this conflict that we're talking about, but there is a conflict within science fiction about which authors get heard and recognized and what have you. I don't know if you've done any coverage of it.
Oh,
you would
yeah.
wanna
I mean, the Mary Sue is...
summarize very briefly what that whole controversy was about.
Well, just that I think we've pretty much touched on it, but basically that, the Hugos have been ruined because all of these authors who are women and people of color and, on the LGBT, in the LGBT camp, are all trying to push their agendas, and they're ruining science fiction because it's not about like quality of the work anymore. It's about these issues and having an agenda. And so the way they see it, they're being heroes by doing this. They're saving science fiction to be its like truest, purest self by promoting authors that in their mind are real science fiction and not catering to an agenda or what have you. And so they created, they called themselves the Sad Puppies, and then there was an offshoot group called the Rabid Puppies. It's all very stupid.
It goes deep.
It's
It goes deep, y'all, is basically what I'm saying.
it's hardcore. You can go to the Mary Sue, that's themarysue.com. Type in Hugos and type in Gamergate. You'll find all sorts of fun stuff.
All sorts of stuff.
All sorts of great
And the things
stuff.
that track you on the internet will stay with you
Oh
forever.
my God, but yeah, so basically they're afraid. And I think it all boils down to the idea that if, you've been used to a certain amount of power for a long time, you've been used to having your say and not even having to think about it, the idea of other people wanting to have a say too is very scary because that means you're gonna take away from me. If you get to have a say, that means I get to say less. Whoa. But what you need to remember is that doesn't mean you don't get to say anything at all. It just means other people get to talk too. Like, it's not nobody's erasing anybody. Nobody's like, but there have been groups of people that have been erased for a long time and really are kind of overdue to get attention and support and exposure. But yeah, I think it does, the fact that people are getting so angry and the fact that there is this backlash is kind of a testament to, one, that things are working, that we are slowly but surely becoming more diverse and realizing that this is important, and that there's, usually people are the biggest crybabies when there's nothing they can do about something. Like, it's a freight train, and all they can do is kick and scream because that's all they have left. So while a lot of their kicking and screaming can be very harmful and like in very real ways, the fact is it's happening whether they want it or not. But it's not a danger to them, and I wish there's a way to make that point clear, that nobody's looking to take away anything.
Do I see another hand from the audience up here?
Yeah, I wanted to clarify some of the demographics. California right now is 30% Latino. So the future predictions of the United States would be 30% Latino by the 2040s. The prediction for a majority California would be 2060s right now. But so then that means possibly for the next few generations, starting in the 2040s, will be majority Latino and probably need to speak Spanish. But my prediction, or I'm sure with 2/6 of the world population, probably the demographers are going to say we should be learning Mandarin or Hindi because the probably be an Asian century in a few generations. But so then my question, to get off the explainer,
Thank
you for that.
Thank you for the demographic clarification.
Is then the new minority will be white males. And so what do you think then the future will be for protection or respect for people who might be allies now or not allies, because they're really two far extremes, right? We have the Donald Sterlings and the apartheid model, where I'm not going to give up power, versus, to pick a name, the Joe Bidens, sort of a compassionate white leader, white male leader. So what do you think then the prediction will be for how we will flip sort of how we do diversity? My own nonprofit, Diverse Scholar, one of our slogans is, we're all minorities, let's help each other, because being a minority really just depends upon your context. And so things are going to be really different when we're going to be Latino majority or, let's say, Asian majority in a few centuries.
So broadly, from the features that you've seen, how will you think about majority-minority divide or dynamic as we look ahead?
I want to reference an activist who's also a sci-fi writer, and her name is Adrienne Marie Brown, and she's inspired by Octavia Butler novels. And what she does is she looked at how they built communities, and she kind of teaches that as another model of how to lead, how to create communities, how to create collectivity. So I think that there's kind of this assumption, in part based on some of our models of the past, that if there's a majority, then that means oppressed minority, right? But that's not the only model of how people can work collectively, which is why, I think the fact that Adrienne's looking at Octavia Butler novels as this reference in how to build communities and how to build these interrelationships is so important, because it shows that this kind of top-down way of working, it's really not going to work for anyone, regardless of color, regardless of who's supposedly in power. And even the notion of what power is, it's also something that's really kind of being deconstructed. So I think it's more or less about who's majority, who's minority, because obviously you have the South African example, right? But it's more about looking at how you take what people bring to the table and integrate those concepts in a way that can benefit everyone. And that's, at least for many of us, that's probably a shift in thinking that I think is well worth embracing.
Well, it's interesting. I totally agree with that that model doesn't work for anybody. I mean, it's really a case of like the bullied then becoming the bullies, And because I'm in the geek space a lot, if you hadn't noticed, I mean, it is something that...
I think we are all proudly, ONA15 is like proudly geek
a bunch of
space.
nerds, right?
Yeah.
So,
Like,
okay, so I can speak
we
freely.
own
This
that,
is a safe
I think.
space.
It's okay.
Is our thing, yeah.
No, but like it's, I mean, you see it happening just as like a microcosm for everything else. Like in geek spaces, for example, for a long time, the stereotype was, white male teenagers in their rooms playing video games and like rah, rah, rah. And then, like, as there becomes more of a presence at, like, sci-fi conventions like San Diego Comic-Con or stuff like that, as more women start to attend, as a more racially diverse group of people start to attend, as we start to see more LGBTQ comics and films and stuff in genre, it used to be that, like, being a geek meant you got picked on all the time, right? All these, you know, white suburban boys getting picked on for being nerds, and they're very angry about that, and so they liked keeping it a safe space for them. Now, the way they see it, this safe space for these bullied people that got picked on all the time is now being infringed upon by all these other people, and no, this is our space. But the thing is, you've got women, you've got people of color, you've got, you know, gays and lesbians who have also been picked on their whole lives, who are looking for a safe space, but rather than opening it up, they want to close it. And not give them that access, where what they should be doing is saying, hey, we all like the same stuff. We should all hang out, right? This is our common ground. And so, yeah, I think exactly it's more about sharing what our different ethnicities have to offer, rather than, you know, marking the differences and separating everything.
I think one interesting, I think to tie back to Yatasha's point earlier, that which I like, race is a technology. Race is a technology. Race is a tool that has been used to sort of engineer society in different ways. One recommendation for a book that's not a futurist book, but Nell Irving Painter's The History of Whiteness. Whiteness as a technology, as an invention, has been rapacious in its appetites. It has grown significantly. It would not be surprising if our concept of what is white, or what it means to be white, in 20 years, 50 years, if such a concept exists, is pretty different. Possibly more expansive, possibly less so than it is today. So we are gonna wrap it up, but I want to do one quick lightning round. We've talked about a lot of works. You all have a lot of things to go back, a lot of visions of the future to consume, but real quick, starting with Cheryl, moving to Yatasha, and then to Teresa, if you could demand that each person in our audience today go back and encounter one vision of the future that you think is particularly compelling, which one do you ask?
I would tell everyone to read a book I haven't even talked about yet, which is Chiang-Rae Lee's On Such a Full Sea.
On Such a Full Sea, Chiang-Rae Lee. Yatasha.
I would ask people to check out the film that I'm working on called Star City, which takes place in Chicago, and it's a cast of characters in a bar that's actually a portal to other worlds. But it's on the south side of the city, so it kind of flips the concept of how we view sci-fi today.
And Teresa.
Oh, God. I was not prepared for this. I definitely, and I wasn't intending to talk about it, so I will recommend it again in this slot, is to read the Newsflesh trilogy. Because it's amazing. It's been out for a while, but I just read it recently, and it was, like, amazing. So, yeah, Mira Grant is the author. The first book is called Feed, and it's the Newsflesh trilogy. Check that out, because it has a lot to say about gender, about the press, and about what to do in a zombie apocalypse.
Octavia Butler's got a giant corpus. So I'm gonna put one out there for Kindred. I love me some Kindred, so that's my recommendation. You all have been terrific. Thank you very much for joining us today to talk about the future. Please come and introduce yourselves afterwards. And I am going to play us out with some more Janelle Monáe. Queen.
In the mirror.